If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. Lost in a golf course snowstorm. I still can't believe how close we came to disaster that night. It started as a fun idea, sledding down the hills of the old golf course on a snowy weekend. There were 4 of us, me, my brother Jake, and our friends Aaron and Sam. The course was just a 10-minute walk from my house, and we'd done it before plenty of times, but this time felt different. The snow was falling heavier than usual, thick flakes that stuck to our jackets and clung to our hair. By the time we got there, the hills were blanketed in a perfect layer of white, untouched. It felt like something out of a postcard, and we couldn't wait to dive in. At first, everything was great. We raced down the slopes on sleds and improvised cardboard pieces, laughing like kids. The air was freezing but fresh, and the moonlight made the snow glow. But then the wind started picking up. It was subtle at first, a gentle breeze that made us pull our hoods tighter. Within half an hour, though, it turned into something fierce. Gusts that whipped the snow around in spiraling clouds, making it hard to see. That's when Aaron suggested we head back. None of us wanted to admit it, but the fun had turned into something else. This gnawing feeling of unease, like we'd stayed out too long and were about to pay for it. We grabbed our sleds and started walking back toward where we thought the path home was. But the snowstorm made everything look the same. What had been clear trails earlier were now buried under several inches of fresh snow, and the wind was so strong it felt like needles against our faces. I remember looking around and realizing I couldn't see the clubhouse anymore, just endless white in every direction. Jake tried to lead us, saying he remembered the way, but after about 10 minutes, it was obvious we were going in circles. I kept seeing the same twisted tree, its branches heavy with snow, and my stomach sank. We were lost. The panic set in gradually. At first, we kept joking, trying to stay lighthearted. Aaron even said, "This is like a scene from one of those survival shows," and we all laughed nervously. But then Sam slipped and twisted his ankle, and that's when it hit me how serious this was. The temperature was plummeting, and none of us were dressed for hours in a storm like this. I could feel my toes going numb, even through my boots, and the wind made it almost impossible to talk without shouting. Every time I turned my head, I expected to see lights in the distance. Something, anything, but there was nothing. Just snow and darkness closing in. After what felt like an hour of trudging, my legs started to burn, and I could barely feel my hands. Sam was leaning on Jake, limping badly, and Aaron kept looking back, like she was hoping someone would magically appear to save us. The storm was relentless. Every time we thought we were making progress, the wind would howl and erase our footprints, leaving us more disoriented. I started to feel this sinking dread, like we might actually be stuck out there all night. My phone was useless, no service, and the cold had drained the battery almost instantly. When I told the others, I could see the fear in their eyes, though no one said it out loud. At one point, we came across a small, half-frozen pond. It looked familiar, but in the swirling snow, I couldn't be sure. Aaron thought it was near the 7th hole, which meant we were way off course. Jake said we should follow the tree line, but Sam insisted we stay put and wait for the storm to die down. We argued for a few minutes, voices rising over the wind, but eventually, the cold pushed us to keep moving. Standing still wasn't an option. I remember thinking how surreal it all felt, like we were in some endless, frozen maze with no way out. It was the first time in my life I really understood what it meant to feel helpless. As we pressed on, the storm seemed to grow even more violent. I could barely see Jake in front of me, and he was only a few feet away. The snow was coming down in sheets now, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. My legs were so tired that I kept stumbling, and I could hear Sam groaning behind me. At one point, Erin slipped, falling hard onto the icy ground. She didn't get up right away, and I rushed over, terrified she was hurt. She waved me off, but I could see tears in her eyes. Whether from pain, frustration, or the cold, I couldn't tell. Then, out of nowhere, we spotted something in the distance. A faint glow. It was so dim I thought I was imagining it at first, but as we kept walking, it grew brighter. "That's got to be the clubhouse," Jake said, his voice cracking with relief. The hope it gave us was like a shot of adrenaline. We moved faster, even Sam, who was practically dragging his leg by then. But as we got closer, the light didn't look right. It wasn't steady like a building's lights. It flickered, almost like a lantern swinging in the wind. A deep pit formed in my stomach, but no one else seemed to notice, or maybe they were just too desperate to care. When we reached the source of the light, my heart dropped. It wasn't the clubhouse. It was a single, old-fashioned lantern hanging from a crooked wooden post. The post was buried halfway in the snow, leaning like it had been there for years. None of us could understand how it was even lit. There were no tracks around it, no signs of anyone else being nearby. Jake tried to brush it off, muttering, "It's probably just part of the course," but I could see the confusion on his face. Golf courses don't have random lanterns like this, and we all knew it. Still, it was some kind of marker, and that was better than nothing. We decided to follow the direction the lantern was facing, hoping it might lead to another part of the course we recognized. But the longer we walked, the stranger it got. The trees around us seemed different, taller, darker, like they were closing in. The snow was so heavy it muffled every sound, and the only noise was the crunch of our boots and the wind howling through the branches. My sense of time was completely warped. It felt like we'd been walking for hours, but the lantern's light still seemed to hover behind us, always the same distance away, no matter how far we went. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing there in the snow. The uneasiness grew with every step. The lantern's light was no longer comforting. It felt like it was watching us, following us. Erin finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "We should have hit a road or something by now." None of us answered. What could we say? She was right. The golf course wasn't that big, and yet we were completely lost. Worse, the wind seemed to carry faint sounds, whispers that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I told myself it was just the storm, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Then we saw it, another lantern, exactly like the first. It was hanging from a tree this time, its light swaying gently in the wind. My stomach churned. We hadn't doubled back. I was certain of that. Jake went up to it, shouting into the storm, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice echoed, but there was no response. He looked back at us, his face pale. "This is insane," he said, shaking his head. None of us could argue. We were exhausted, freezing, and now it felt like we weren't alone out there. Whatever hope the first lantern had given us was gone. By this point, the cold was unbearable. My fingers felt like they were burning, and Sam could barely keep moving. We decided to stop under a cluster of trees to shield ourselves from the wind, at least for a moment. Huddled together, I couldn't stop shaking. Whether from the cold or fear, I wasn't sure anymore. Erin suddenly gasped, clutching my arm. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. I strained to listen, and then I heard it too. Faint footsteps crunching in the snow, coming from somewhere behind us. They didn't sound like ours, too steady, too deliberate. We froze, staring into the storm, but we couldn't see anything. Jake grabbed a broken branch from the ground, his knuckles white as he gripped it. "If someone's messing with us, this isn't funny," he yelled, his voice shaking. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Then, as if to mock us, the faint glow of another lantern appeared ahead, barely visible through the swirling snow. None of us wanted to move toward it, but staying where we were felt even worse. With no other choice, we forced ourselves to get up and push forward, each step heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wanted us to follow. As we neared the third lantern, my mind was racing. What were we walking into? The light flickered erratically now, casting strange, shifting shadows on the snow. When we reached it, I realized there was something odd about the tree it hung from. Its bark was blackened and cracked, like it had been struck by lightning. The air felt heavier around it, colder somehow. Sam muttered, "We need to turn back," but Jake snapped, "And go where? We're already lost." His frustration was obvious, but it felt like we were unraveling. No one wanted to admit it, but we were terrified. Then, from somewhere nearby, a sound broke through the storm, a low, guttural noise, like an animal growling. Except it wasn't. It was too deep, too unnatural. We all stopped, our breath catching. Erin grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What was that?" she whispered, barely audible. No one answered. Jake swung the branch in front of him, as if that would help, but the sound came again, closer this time. It was circling us. I could feel it in my chest, this primal sense that we were being hunted. Without a word, we all started running, our sleds abandoned, the lanterns vanishing behind us. Running through the snow was a nightmare. My boots kept sinking, and the cold bit into my lungs with every breath. The growling noise didn't follow us. It stayed behind, lingering near the lanterns, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe yet. The snowstorm made everything look the same, endless and featureless. Every tree we passed felt like one we'd seen before, and the idea that we might just collapse out here started creeping into my head. My legs burned, and my fingers were stiff, but fear kept me moving. Finally, after what felt like forever, we saw a break in the trees. A faint outline of a building emerged through the storm. It was the clubhouse. Relief flooded over me, and for the first time in hours, I felt like we might actually make it out. We stumbled toward it, half laughing and half crying from exhaustion and relief. But as we got closer, something felt off. The windows were dark, and the building seemed smaller than it should have been. When we reached it, we realized why. It wasn't the clubhouse. It was an old shed, rotting and covered in snow, with a rusted padlock hanging from the door. Standing in front of that shed, the relief we'd felt turned to dread. It was like the storm was mocking us, throwing one false hope after another. Jake banged on the door, yelling for help, but the shed was clearly abandoned. The wind howled around us, almost drowning him out, and I noticed something strange. The growling noise had stopped. The silence felt worse somehow, like whatever had been following us was waiting, watching. Erin pulled her scarf tighter around her face and whispered, "We can't stay here." She was right. The shed offered no shelter, and the storm was only getting worse. Jake reluctantly stepped away, his shoulders slumped, and we started walking again, following what we hoped was the right direction. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those lanterns flickering in the distance, but there was nothing. After about 15 minutes of stumbling through the snow, we finally saw something that looked familiar, the outline of a fence. My heart jumped. It was part of the course. We followed it, and within minutes, we were back on the main path leading to the parking lot. When we saw the headlights of a parked car, I nearly cried. Somehow, we'd made it out. When we reached the parking lot, the storm had started to let up. The snow was still falling, but the wind had died down, and we could finally see clearly. Jake's car was sitting there, covered in a thick layer of snow, like it had been waiting for us for hours. We piled in, shivering and exhausted, the heater struggling to warm us up. None of us spoke at first. The relief of being out of the storm was overwhelming, but there was something else, a lingering tension, like we couldn't shake what had just happened. As we drove away, I looked back at the course, expecting to see nothing but white hills and trees. Instead, I spotted a faint light in the distance. It flickered, just like the lanterns had. I opened my mouth to say something, but then I stopped. What was the point? No one would believe me, and honestly, I didn't even believe it myself. We didn't talk about the growling, the lanterns, or the strange feeling that something had been out there with us. To this day, I don't know what we walked into that night, but I know one thing for sure: we were lucky to get out. And I'll never set foot on that golf course again. The imposter upstairs. It was the winter of my sophomore year in high school, and I remember that day vividly because it felt like the world outside had gone silent. A blizzard had rolled in overnight, burying everything in thick, powdery snow. My mom worked late at the hospital, and my dad was away on a business trip, so it was just me and my best friend Jenna in the house. Jenna had slept over the night before because her place was too far for her parents to risk driving in the storm. My mom had called earlier in the evening, saying she'd try to make it back but to lock the doors and not wait up for her. We did what any teens would do, raided the kitchen for snacks and set up camp in the living room with movies and blankets. By around 10 p.m., the snow outside was still falling in thick sheets, blanketing the streetlights and muffling every sound. The house had that heavy, quiet stillness you only get when you're completely snowed in. Jenna and I were mid-laugh at some dumb joke when we heard it, the sound of someone walking upstairs. It was faint but unmistakable, the creak of the wooden floorboards above us. We froze. My house is old, and noises aren't unusual, but this wasn't the random settling of a house in the cold. These were deliberate footsteps, steady and slow, moving from the direction of my parents' bedroom toward the stairs. Jenna's eyes went wide, and she whispered, "Is your mom back?" I shook my head. "She would have called," I said, my voice trembling. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then, clear as day, I heard my mom's voice calling down the stairs. "Honey, can you come up here for a second?" It was her tone, calm, casual, like she'd just gotten home and wanted to ask me something. Except, it wasn't right. There was an edge to it, a slight distortion, like when you hear your voice on a recording and it doesn't sound like you thought it did. I stood there, frozen, as Jenna grabbed my arm. "That's your mom, right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I couldn't respond. Something deep in my gut told me it wasn't her. My mom always called me by my nickname, not Honey, and she never sounded like that. The footsteps continued upstairs, pacing back and forth, but now they were heavier, almost deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, it was wanted us to hear them. Jenna must have seen the panic on my face because she yanked me toward the kitchen and hissed, "Call her. Right now." With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone from the counter and dialed my mom's number. It rang once, twice, and then she picked up. Her voice was groggy, like I'd woken her up. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, clearly still at the hospital. My stomach dropped. Whoever, or whatever, was upstairs wasn't her. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom, you're at work, right?" I asked, my eyes darting toward the dark hallway leading to the stairs. Jenna clutched my arm tighter, her nails digging into my skin. "Of course I am," my mom replied, sounding concerned now. "Why? Is everything okay?" I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Just then, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe it was over, like whoever it was had just gone. But then, from the bottom of the stairs, we heard my mom's voice again. "Sweetheart, come here. I need your help." It was closer this time, more insistent, and somehow colder. My throat tightened as Jenna shook her head furiously, mouthing, "No." I ended the call with my mom without saying goodbye, too terrified to explain. Jenna and I stared at each other, and for a second, I could feel the air between us thicken with a shared dread. Then we heard it again, those slow, deliberate footsteps, but this time they were coming down the stairs. I couldn't move, couldn't even think. Every creak of the wood sounded louder than the last, like it was amplifying the tension in the air. And then, halfway down the staircase, the footsteps stopped. "Sweetheart." The voice came again, but now it sounded completely wrong, like someone trying to imitate my mom but getting the tone and cadence just slightly off. It lingered in the air, unnaturally long, like the word was stretching beyond its limits. I grabbed Jenna's hand, and we bolted for the back door. The snowstorm outside was vicious, the wind howling and snow whipping around us, but I'd take freezing to death over whatever was in that house. We fumbled with the door lock, my shaking fingers slipping on the icy metal. Jenna kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale. "It's at the bottom of the stairs," she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. I didn't dare look. I could feel it, something watching us, waiting. Finally, I got the door open, and we stumbled out into the backyard, the freezing cold cutting through our thin layers. We made it halfway to the garage before I turned back, drawn by some morbid need to see. The back door was still open, swaying slightly in the wind. The kitchen light spilled out onto the snow, and in that glow, I saw a shadow move, slow and deliberate. It didn't look like my mom. It didn't look like anyone. Just this tall, distorted silhouette that seemed to shift and flicker as it stepped back into the house, vanishing into the darkness. We ran to the garage, slamming the door shut behind us. It was pitch dark inside except for the faint glow from a window high up on the wall, letting in just enough light to see the outlines of the old workbench and a pile of storage boxes. My breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale visible in the freezing air. Jenna was holding onto my arm like her life depended on it, whispering frantically, "What was that? What the hell was that?" But I didn't have an answer. I pulled my phone out, my fingers trembling so badly it almost slipped out of my grip. I was about to call my mom again when Jenna grabbed my wrist. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" I froze, straining to listen. At first, all I could hear was the wind howling outside. But then it came, a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the snow. It was coming closer. My stomach dropped. We crouched behind the workbench, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my entire body. The sound stopped just outside the garage door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoed through the metal door. Jenna clapped a hand over her mouth to muffle a gasp. "Sweetheart," the voice called from the other side, softer now, almost gentle. But it wasn't my mom's voice anymore. It was deeper, raspier, like something ancient trying to sound human. "Come out. It's so cold out here." The door handle rattled, and I thought I might pass out from the fear. Jenna was shaking her head furiously, her eyes wide with terror. I gripped her hand, and we both held our breath, praying it would go away. The rattling stopped, and for a few agonizing moments, there was silence again. Then we heard it, footsteps crunching in the snow, slowly circling the garage. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't stay here, but running back into the house or out into the storm felt like walking straight into its trap. Jenna tugged on my sleeve, her face pale as a ghost. "We have to hide," she mouthed, pointing toward the stack of storage boxes in the far corner. We crawled as quietly as we could, every scrape of our clothes against the floor sounding impossibly loud. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the wall, and my blood ran cold. A shadow moved past the frosted window, tall and impossibly thin, its shape distorted by the ice. Jenna and I squeezed behind the boxes, huddling together as we tried to stay completely still. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I almost screamed. I fumbled to silence it, but it was too late. The footsteps outside resumed, faster now, heading toward the side door of the garage. "It heard us," Jenna whispered, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what to do. The knob jiggled once, twice, and then stopped. My breath hitched as the shadow outside the window disappeared. For a moment, I thought it had gone. Then, from above us, we heard a loud, deliberate thud. My stomach turned to ice. Whatever it was, it had climbed onto the roof. The thuds moved across the ceiling, slow and heavy, as if it was searching for a way in. Jenna clutched my arm, and I could feel her nails digging into my skin. We stared up at the ceiling, listening as the sound traveled to the far side of the garage. Suddenly, it stopped. Silence. And then, the most chilling sound yet, a low, rasping chuckle that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. That laugh froze me to my core. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make every hair on my body stand on end. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. Jenna was squeezing my arm so tightly now that I could barely feel my fingers. "It's on the roof," she mouthed, her lips barely moving. I nodded, too scared to speak. We stayed as still as we could, every second stretching into what felt like hours. The thudding on the roof started again, this time moving toward the edge near the window. A shadow flickered across the frosted glass, its distorted shape barely resembling anything human. Then, all at once, the garage went silent. No footsteps, no wind, no creaking from the storm outside. Just an oppressive, eerie stillness that made my chest feel like it was about to cave in. I thought maybe it had finally left. Maybe it was over. But then we heard the side door creak open. My stomach dropped. Jenna's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream as the door swung inward, the hinges squealing like they hadn't been used in decades. The freezing air rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, echoing on the concrete floor of the garage. The thing stopped in the middle of the room, just beyond the boxes where we were hiding. I could hear it breathing, ragged and uneven, like it was trying to mimic the sound of a person but didn't quite know how. My entire body was shaking as I peeked through a small gap between the boxes. My heart nearly stopped. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head almost brushing the low ceiling. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnaturally hunched, and its face, if you could even call it that, was blank, featureless, except for a jagged, unnatural grin that seemed to split it in half. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming, and Jenna buried her face in my shoulder, trembling. The thing didn't move right away. It just stood there, that grotesque grin frozen in place as if it was waiting for something. The air felt suffocating, like the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Then, it did the one thing I'll never forget. It tilted its head, sharply, like a puppet on strings, and whispered in that distorted voice, "Sweetheart, I know you're here." My heart nearly stopped. The way it spoke, like it knew exactly where we were, sent a wave of panic through me. Jenna and I didn't dare move. The thing started walking again, its footsteps echoing louder now, each step deliberate and slow, as if it was savoring the moment. I could hear it getting closer to our hiding spot. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Then, it stopped. The silence was unbearable, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. I was too afraid to look, too afraid to breathe. I could feel Jenna shaking beside me, her nails digging into my arm. Suddenly, the boxes in front of us shifted, just slightly, like something had brushed against them. My stomach dropped. It was right there, inches away. But before I could fully process what was happening, a loud bang echoed through the garage. The sound came from outside, like something had slammed against the garage door. The thing jerked its head toward the noise, its body moving in an unnatural, twitchy motion. For a moment, I thought it might leave. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl and began stalking toward the door. This was our chance. Jenna grabbed my hand, and we bolted. We didn't think, didn't hesitate. We just ran. The thing let out a screech, this horrible, inhuman sound, as we flung open the back door and sprinted into the storm. The snowstorm hit us like a wall, the wind biting into our skin and the cold stealing the breath from our lungs. Jenna and I didn't look back. We couldn't. We sprinted toward the tree line at the edge of my backyard, hoping to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. The snow was deep, almost up to our knees, and every step felt like pushing through quicksand. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were freezing from the inside, but I didn't dare stop. Behind us, I could hear it, those unnatural, heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. It was following us. The screeching sound it made earlier had stopped, but now it was humming. The tune was strange, almost melodic, but completely alien. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jenna tripped, falling face first into the snow, and I skidded to a stop to help her up. "Go!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Just go." But there was no way I was leaving her behind. I pulled her to her feet, and we stumbled forward, our shoes soaking through as we reached the edge of the woods. The trees were dense, their bare, skeletal branches twisting together like an impenetrable wall. The wind howled through the forest, drowning out almost all sound, but I could still hear that thing behind us, its footsteps heavier now, faster. It was closing in. We dove into the woods, weaving between the trees as the snow blinded us and the icy branches scratched at our faces. Jenna was sobbing, but I kept pulling her forward, refusing to let go. The footsteps were right behind us now, impossibly close, and that horrible humming was louder than ever. I could feel it, like it was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. Then, just as I thought we couldn't go any further, we burst into a clearing. The clearing was small, surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the wind. In the center was an old, abandoned hunting shack, its roof half caved in and its wooden walls covered in frost. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but at that moment, it felt like our only chance. I half dragged Jenna toward it, shoving the creaky door open and pulling her inside. The interior was even more decrepit than the outside. The floorboards sagged under our weight, and the air smelled of damp wood and mildew. A broken chair and a rusted stove sat in one corner, covered in cobwebs. Jenna collapsed against the wall, clutching her knees to her chest, her breath coming in ragged sobs. I pressed myself against the door, holding it shut with all my weight. Outside, the footsteps slowed, crunching just beyond the clearing. It was there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, that oppressive presence lingering just beyond the thin wooden walls. The humming started again, lower this time, almost like a lullaby. Jenna whimpered, covering her ears, and I clenched my jaw, trying to block it out. My mind was racing. What did it want? Why was it doing this? The footsteps started again, circling the shack. Each creak of snow felt deliberate, taunting. I held my breath as it stopped right outside the door. The wood creaked under its weight as something pressed against the other side, pushing gently. I could feel the pressure against my back, and my heart felt like it might explode. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, it spoke again. "Sweetheart, let me in." The door groaned under the strain, but I held firm, digging my heels into the rotting floorboards. Jenna let out a muffled scream, and I turned to see her pointing toward the window. My stomach dropped. There, pressed against the frosted glass, was its face, or what was pretending to be a face. That grotesque grin stretched even wider as it stared at us, unblinking. I stared at the thing in the window, unable to look away. Its face, or whatever it was so wrong, so inhuman, that it felt like my mind couldn't fully process it. The grin stretched too far, curling up at the edges like it was splitting its head in two. And its eyes, if you could call them that, were black pits, bottomless and devoid of any life. It didn't move, just pressed against the glass, watching us. Then, slowly, it raised one unnaturally long hand and tapped the window. Once, twice, 3 times, each sound sharp and deliberate. "Sweetheart," it crooned again, its voice dripping with mock affection. "I can see you." My blood ran cold. Jenna was shaking violently now, tears streaming down her face as she clung to my arm. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I was too terrified to think, my body paralyzed with fear. The thing tapped the window one last time before vanishing into the storm. Just like that, it was gone. For a moment, I thought maybe it had left, but deep down, I knew better. It was still out there, waiting. The silence in the shack was deafening, broken only by the sound of our labored breathing. Then, without warning, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the entire structure. Jenna screamed, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the broken chair. The storm howled outside, snow and wind whipping into the room, but the thing wasn't there. At least, not that I could see. I grabbed Jenna's hand, pulling her toward the back of the shack. There had to be another way out. We scrambled over the debris, my heart pounding as the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then, just as we reached the back wall, the humming started again, louder this time, echoing through the small space. It was inside. The humming reverberated through the shack, a low, bone-chilling sound that seemed to seep into my very core. Jenna and I spun around, our backs pressed against the icy wall. The room felt darker now, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, like they were alive. My eyes darted around, searching for it, but the thing was nowhere to be seen. Only its voice filled the room. "I'm here, sweetheart," it whispered, each word oozing with sinister glee. "You can't hide." The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the walls and making it impossible to pinpoint its location. Jenna was gripping my arm so tightly it felt like she might cut off my circulation. I tried to speak, to tell her we had to move, but my throat was dry, and no sound came out. Then, out of the corner of I saw it. The thing was crouched in the far corner of the shack, its impossibly long limbs folded awkwardly as it stared at us with that grotesque grin. Its body seemed to shimmer, flickering in and out of focus like a glitching video. For a moment, I thought it might not be real, but then it moved. It unfolded itself with a sickening crack, its limbs straightening as it rose to its full height. The ceiling of the shack was low, but the thing didn't seem to care. It hunched forward, its head tilted at that unnerving angle, and took a step toward us. Jenna screamed, the sound high-pitched and raw, and I felt my instincts finally kick in. I grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor, part of the old chair, and swung it in front of us, trying to keep the thing at bay. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice cracking. The thing stopped, tilting its head again as if curious. Then, to my horror, it laughed. The sound was hollow, echoing unnaturally, and it sent shivers down my spine. The laughter grew louder, filling the shack until it felt like the walls might collapse under its weight. I held the jagged piece of wood tighter, though I knew deep down it wouldn't do anything. The thing was playing with us, mocking our fear. It took another step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. Jenna was crying now, full on sobbing, her hands pressed against her face as she slid down to the floor. "We're going to die," she whispered. her voice barely audible over the storm outside. "It's going to kill us." I refused to believe that. I couldn't. There had to be a way out. My eyes darted around the room, desperate for anything that could help. Then I saw it, a narrow hatch in the corner of the floor, half hidden beneath a pile of debris. It looked like it led to a cellar or crawl space. "Jenna," I hissed, grabbing her arm. "The hatch. Move." She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror, but she didn't hesitate. Together, we scrambled toward the corner as the thing let out another low, guttural growl. It moved faster now, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. I shoved Jenna toward the hatch and threw myself on top of it, yanking at the rusted handle. It didn't budge. My hand slipped against the icy metal, my heart pounding as the thing loomed closer. "Come on," I screamed, throwing all my weight against it. With a deafening screech, the hatch finally gave way, the wood splintering as it popped open. Jenna didn't wait for me to say anything. She dove in headfirst, disappearing into the darkness below. I was right behind her, slamming the hatch shut just as the thing reached us. Its hand scraped against the wood, and for a split second, I thought it might rip the hatch right off its hinges. We tumbled into the darkness, landing on cold, damp earth. The air was heavy and smelled of mildew, making it hard to breathe. I scrambled to pull the hatch shut above us, shoving a broken crate against it as a makeshift barrier. Jenna was curled up in the corner, shaking uncontrollably. "What now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know. My mind was blank except for the sheer, overwhelming need to survive. Above us, the thing thumped against the hatch, the sound reverberating through the small space. Each hit made the wood groan, and I could see bits of dirt and dust raining down from the edges. "It's not going to stop," Jenna muttered, tears streaking her face. I reached out and grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll figure something out," I lied. I didn't believe my own words, but I couldn't let her give up. The thumping stopped suddenly, and the silence was almost worse. We sat there in the dark, the only sound our ragged breathing. I strained to listen, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no humming, no laughter. Just the oppressive quiet. "Do you think it's gone?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. I wanted to say yes, but something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The air around us felt heavier, colder. Then, from somewhere deeper in the crawl space, we heard it, a low, scraping sound, like nails dragging against stone. My blood turned to ice. Jenna's grip on my hand tightened as her wide eyes met mine. "It's down here," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned toward the darkness, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear it. The scraping grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from all around us. "Run," I whispered, pulling Jenna to her feet. We stumbled forward, deeper into the crawl space, the uneven ground making it nearly impossible to move quickly. Behind us, the scraping turned into a low growl, and then the humming started again, louder than ever. The crawl space felt endless, the walls narrowing as we stumbled forward in the pitch black. My phone's flashlight barely lit more than a few feet ahead, and the beam wavered with my shaking hands. The growling behind us grew louder, guttural and animalistic, yet still layered with that eerie, almost mocking hum. Every time I dared glance back, I saw nothing but shadows, though I could feel it, its presence crawling closer, suffocating. "Keep moving," I urged Jenna, though my legs felt like lead. She was sobbing openly now, her breaths ragged and uneven. The ground beneath us was damp and freezing, soaking through our clothes as we stumbled through the narrow passage. Then, my light caught something up ahead, a wooden slat, cracked and rotting, set into the earthen wall. A way out? I didn't care what it was. It was hope. We scrambled toward it, clawing at the wood with raw, frozen fingers. The slats groaned under our weight, and with a final push, they gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel that led upward. A faint draft of cold air rushed through, and I realized it must lead outside. "Go!" I shouted, boosting Jenna into the opening. She hesitated for a split second, her face pale and terrified, but she climbed. I shoved her upward, glancing back one last time. That's when I saw it, its face emerging from the shadows. It wasn't walking anymore, it was crawling, its grotesque limbs bending at impossible angles as it slithered toward us. Its grin was wider now, stretching impossibly far, splitting its face like a wound. Its black, hollow eyes locked onto mine, and it whispered in that distorted, rasping voice, "You can't escape." I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I scrambled into the tunnel, following Jenna as fast as I could. The thing was right behind me now. I could feel its icy breath on my neck, hear its fingers scraping against the walls as it climbed after us. The tunnel narrowed, the air growing thinner, and just as I thought I might get stuck, Jenna reached the surface, pulling herself out into the storm. Jenna reached down, grabbing my arm and pulling with all her strength as I scrambled up the last few feet of the tunnel. Behind me, I could hear it, the thing's claws raking against the dirt walls, its growls echoing louder with every passing second. My chest burned from the effort, but I pushed myself harder, fueled by sheer terror. Just as I felt its cold fingers brush against my ankle, I burst out into the open air. The storm was still raging, snow whipping around us in blinding sheets, but the fresh air was a relief after the suffocating crawl space. Jenna and I didn't stop. We bolted across the clearing, slipping and stumbling as the icy wind tore at our clothes. Behind us, the tunnel entrance was dark and still, but I knew better than to think we were safe. "Where do we go?" Jenna shouted over the howling wind, her voice shrill with panic. My mind raced, trying to remember the layout of the woods. Then I saw it, the faint glow of streetlights through the trees, just barely visible in the distance. "That way!" I yelled, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the light. The woods were a blur as we ran, branches snagging at our clothes and snow soaking through to our skin. I kept expecting to hear the thing behind us, but there was only the wind and the sound of our frantic footsteps crunching through the snow. Finally, we broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the deserted street. My house was just up the hill, its windows glowing faintly through the storm. But I couldn't bring myself to go back. Instead, we ran toward the nearest neighbor's house, pounding on the door with everything we had. Lights flicked on inside, and an older man opened the door, his face creased with concern. "What the hell are you kids doing out in this storm?" he asked, pulling us inside. We tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. All I could manage was, "There's something in the woods. It's not human." He gave us a skeptical look but called the police anyway. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, though it felt like an eternity. 2 officers showed up, bundled in thick coats and looking less than thrilled to be out in the storm. Jenna and I sat in the neighbor's living room, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot tea we could barely hold with our shaking hands. When the officers asked what happened, I tried to explain, but every word felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth. "There was someone, or something, in the house," I said, my voice trembling. "It followed us into the woods." Jenna nodded vigorously, her face pale, but the officers exchanged skeptical glances. "You're sure it wasn't just an animal?" one of them asked, his tone cautious but disbelieving. I wanted to scream. An animal didn't mimic voices. An animal didn't grin like that. Still, they agreed to check the house and the woods. They didn't let us come along, which was probably for the best. Jenna and I stayed huddled on the couch, staring at the floor, too afraid to even look at the windows. The storm finally started to ease, and after about an hour, the officers returned. "There's no sign of anyone in the house," one of them said. No footprints in the snow around the garage or the clearing you described. He sounded almost apologetic, like he didn't want to outright accuse us of lying. Maybe you girls just got spooked. It's easy for your imagination to run wild in a storm like this. I wanted to argue, to scream at them that we weren't crazy, but what was the point? Jenna and I knew what we saw, what we heard. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. But there was no proof, no way to make anyone believe us. That night, my mom finally came home, and I stayed glued to her side. Jenna went home the next day, and we didn't talk about it much after that. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear it, the faintest sound of humming, low and melodic, just at the edge of my hearing. I don't know what it wanted, or why it chose us that night. But I do know one thing, it's still out there, and it's waiting. Die written on glass. I'll never forget that night at the cabin. It's burned into my memory like a bad dream you can't shake. My boyfriend, Tom, and I had rented a place near a ski resort for a weekend getaway. The forecast had warned of a snowstorm, but we thought it'd just add to the cozy vibe. By the time we got there, the wind was already howling, and thick flakes were coming down fast. The cabin itself was charming but old, with creaky floors and a wood-burning fireplace that seemed to be the only thing keeping the chill out. It felt isolated, surrounded by dense woods, but we liked the idea of being cut off for a while. That night, after dinner, we settled on the couch with some wine, the storm raging outside, drowning everything else out. Around midnight, just as we were getting ready to head upstairs, I heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was the wind dragging a branch against the siding, but it was too deliberate, like someone dragging something sharp across the wood. I froze, wineglass in hand, and looked at Tom, who shrugged it off, saying it was probably an animal. Still, something about it made the hair on my arms stand up. I pulled the curtain aside to check, but the window was fogged from the inside, and all I could see was the faint outline of the snow-covered deck. The scratching continued, pausing every few seconds, and then something louder, a thud, like a hand slapping against the glass door leading to the patio. Tom tried to reassure me, but I could tell he was tense too. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the patio door. I stayed back, watching from the edge of the living room as he wiped at the foggy glass with his sleeve. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, he slowly turned the lock and cracked the door open. The icy air hit me even from where I stood, but that wasn't what made me shiver, it was the marks. Long, uneven scratches were gouged into the wood of the deck railing, almost like claw marks, but jagged and inconsistent. "See," Tom said, trying to sound calm. "Probably just some animal." But his voice wavered, and he didn't step outside to investigate further. He shut the door, locked it again, and pulled the curtain closed. "Let's just go to bed," he said. I wanted to let it go, but sleep didn't come easy. Tom passed out pretty quickly, but every little creak and groan of the old cabin kept me wide awake. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, this time louder. It wasn't just scratching now, but something heavier, dragging across the deck outside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake Tom. I sat up, holding my breath, and listened. And then, out of the silence, came the unmistakable sound of a finger, or something, squeaking across glass. I turned my head slowly toward the patio door. Even in the darkness, I could see it, letters being scrawled into the fogged-up glass from the outside, "Die." I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen, staring at that word like my brain couldn't fully process it. I wanted to wake Tom, to scream, to do something, but I was terrified that if I moved, whoever, or whatever, it was outside would hear me. The letters sat there, smeared and uneven, like a child's handwriting but more frantic. Slowly, I leaned over and shook Tom's shoulder. He groaned, half asleep, and I whispered, "Tom, wake up. There's someone outside." He sat up groggily, mumbling something about me overreacting, but when he turned his head toward the door, he stopped cold. "What the?" he started, but I slapped my hand over his mouth before he could finish. The last thing I wanted was for whoever was out there to know we were awake. Tom pulled my hand away, but I could see the panic in his eyes now too. "Stay here," he whispered. I shook my head violently, gripping his arm, but he was already reaching for the flashlight. Before I could stop him, he crept toward the glass door. The word was still there, faint but unmistakable, and I could see the beam of his flashlight bouncing off the glass as he tried to peer into the darkness outside. The beam caught something, movement. It was quick, darting just beyond the range of the light. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound brave. No answer, just the wind whipping snow against the house. Then, suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. "Tom," I hissed, but before he could respond, there was a loud bang against the door, like someone, or something, had thrown their entire weight against it. Tom stumbled back, and I swear I saw a shadow move away from the door and disappear into the storm. Tom scrambled back toward me, his face pale. "We need to call someone," he muttered, but when I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, it had no signal. Of course. The storm had knocked everything out. He ran upstairs to check if the landline was working, leaving me alone by the patio door. I wanted to follow him, but my legs felt like lead. My eyes stayed glued to the glass, half expecting to see another word or face pressed against it. I kept telling myself it was just some sick prank, maybe kids messing around, but deep down, I didn't believe that. This didn't feel like a joke. It felt malicious. Tom came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. "Line's dead. No power either." He looked as scared as I felt, and that's when we decided to barricade ourselves in the bedroom. We dragged a dresser in front of the door and locked all the windows, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The wind kept howling outside, masking any sounds that might have been coming from the deck. Then, just as we were about to sit down on the bed, we heard it again, scratching. But this time, it wasn't coming from the patio. It was above us, on the roof. The scratching above us was slow and deliberate, like nails or claws dragging across the shingles. I felt my stomach drop. Tom and I locked eyes, both of us too terrified to say anything. The sound moved across the roof, stopping directly above the bedroom. My brain was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. Animals don't scrawl words on glass, and no person in their right mind would be on the roof in a storm like this. "Stay here," Tom whispered, grabbing a heavy flashlight and heading for the door. I grabbed his arm, shaking my head, but he pulled free. "I'll just check the hallway," he said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the fear in his voice. As soon as he opened the bedroom door, the cold hit us. The upstairs hallway felt freezing, like a window had been left open, but we hadn't touched them since we got there. Tom stepped out, shining the flashlight around, and that's when we saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a set of wet footprints trailed in from the staircase. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, large and uneven, with streaks of mud and something darker smeared alongside them. The prints stopped abruptly halfway down the hall, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had simply vanished. Tom slowly backed into the room and locked the door behind him. "We're not alone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped even more after that. I grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around myself, but it didn't help. My teeth were chattering, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or pure terror. Tom moved to the window and peeked through the blinds. "I don't see anything," he whispered, but the way his hand trembled as he let the blinds fall back into place told me he didn't believe it was over. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, jumping at every creak of the cabin. The storm outside didn't let up, and the wind seemed to scream louder with each passing minute. Just when I thought the worst was behind us, a loud crash came from downstairs. It sounded like glass shattering. I clutched Tom's arm as he grabbed the flashlight again. "Don't," I pleaded, but he shook his head. "We have to know," he said, though I could tell he didn't want to go any more than I did. I followed him this time, holding a heavy fireplace poker we'd grabbed from the bedroom. As we crept down the stairs, the cold got even worse. My breath came out in clouds, and I could see Tom's doing the same. When we reached the living room, my heart stopped. The patio door was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor, and the word "dive" was smeared again on what was left of the fogged glass, this time in something dark. It wasn't just condensation. It looked like blood. Tom stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight shaking as it swept over the broken glass and the words smeared on the door. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but the rational part of my brain was screaming that we couldn't. There was nowhere to go. The storm was still raging outside, and the cabin was miles from the nearest town. Even if we made it to the car, there was no guarantee the icy roads wouldn't kill us before whatever was out there did. "We'll wait until morning," I said, my voice trembling. "Just a few more hours." We moved back upstairs, locking ourselves in the bedroom again. Tom pushed the dresser tighter against the door, and we both sat on the bed, clutching makeshift weapons. The flashlight for him, the fireplace poker for me. But the noise didn't stop. The scratching started again, this time from all around us. The roof. The walls. Even the floor beneath us creaked like something was moving below. It felt like the cabin was alive, surrounding us, trapping us. Then, out of nowhere, came the sound of laughter, low and guttural, like it was being forced through clenched teeth. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, and then fell silent, leaving us in a crushing, unbearable stillness. The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. My ears strained for any sound, any hint of movement, but there was nothing. Just the wind outside and the faint creaking of the old cabin. Tom whispered, "It's messing with us," and for the first time, I saw tears welling in his eyes. That scared me even more than the noise. He wasn't the type to cry, ever. I wanted to comfort him, but I didn't even know how to comfort myself. The only thing we could do was wait. I kept my eyes on the door, gripping the fireplace poker so hard my knuckles hurt. And then, the door handle started to turn. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't the wind, it couldn't be. The dresser blocking the door groaned as something pushed against it from the other side. I scrambled back on the bed, dragging Tom with me, as the door shuddered in its frame. Whatever was out there was strong, stronger than I'd imagined. The handle stopped moving, and for a moment, I thought it might give up. But then came the sound of wood splintering. The top of the doorframe cracked, and a single dark hand pushed through, a hand with long, bony fingers. Its skin blackened and cracked like it had been burned. I screamed, and the hand snapped back, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Tom grabbed my arm, dragging me off the bed toward the far corner of the room. "We have to do something," he hissed, his voice frantic but low. The dresser groaned again, the wood creaking louder, and then it stopped. Everything stopped. No scratching, no laughter, no movement. Just silence. It was so sudden it felt wrong, like the kind of quiet that only comes when you're being watched. I clung to Tom, my heart pounding, as we stared at the door. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. Time didn't feel real anymore. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. It was a whisper, soft and guttural, coming from the other side of the door. It wasn't in English or any language I recognized, but it was rhythmic, almost like a chant. Tom looked at me, his face pale. "We're leaving," he said, his voice trembling. He grabbed the flashlight and inched toward the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. I wanted to scream at him to stop, but I couldn't get the words out. Slowly, he slid the dresser aside, just enough to crack the door open. The hallway was empty. No footprints, no shadows, nothing. But the whispering was louder now, echoing through the house. It was coming from the living room. Tom motioned for me to follow, and as much as every instinct in my body screamed to stay put, I couldn't let him go alone. We crept down the stairs, the flashlight beam shaking as Tom led the way. The whispering grew louder with each step, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. When we reached the bottom, the living room was pitch black except for a faint glow coming from the shattered patio door. At first, I thought it was the reflection of the snowstorm outside, but then I saw them, symbols crudely carved into the walls and furniture. They glowed faintly, pulsing like they were alive. My stomach churned at the sight of them, though I couldn't explain why. The whispering stopped abruptly, plunging us into a silence so deep it felt deafening. Tom shone the flashlight toward the patio door, and that's when we saw it. A figure stood just beyond the broken glass, its silhouette tall and impossibly thin, like a shadow that didn't belong to anything. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if it were studying us. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I felt its gaze, cold and invasive, like it was peeling back my skin. I don't remember grabbing Tom's arm or how we ended up running, but the next thing I knew, we were upstairs, barricading ourselves in the bedroom again. The symbols from the living room burned into my mind. The rest of the night was a blur of terror and exhaustion. We sat in the corner of the bedroom, clutching the flashlight and fireplace poker like they were the only things keeping us alive. The symbols from the living room seemed to flicker in my mind every time I closed my eyes. The whispering didn't come back, nor did the scratching or banging, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. Somehow, we must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is waking to weak sunlight streaming through the blinds. For a moment, I thought it might have been a nightmare. But then I saw the dresser still pushed against the door, the shattered patio glass downstairs, and the word "die" smeared faintly on what little was left of the door. Tom and I didn't say much as we packed up our things and left. We didn't even stop to eat. The snowstorm had finally passed, and we drove back to town in a silence that was only broken when Tom muttered, "Don't tell anyone." I nodded, but deep down, I knew I wouldn't have to. No one would believe us anyway. Later that day, Tom called the cabin rental company to report the damage. The woman on the other end sounded confused and asked what we were talking about. "No storm last night," she said. "And no one stayed in that cabin for months. We only just opened it for the season." Tom hung up without another word, his face pale as a sheet. We've never talked about it again, but sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, swearing I hear scratching on the walls. Unexplained green glow. I was 15 when it happened, living with my parents and little brother in a small town nestled deep in northern Michigan. It was January, the kind of winter where snowdrifts swallowed half the front yard, and the only sounds outside were the muffled howl of the wind and the crunch of boots on packed snow. That night, a snowstorm had rolled in fast, thick flakes slamming against the windows and turning the world outside into a swirling white void. We were all huddled in the living room, the fireplace crackling in the corner. Dad was in his recliner, flipping through channels on the TV. Mom was knitting one of her endless scarves, and my little brother Ethan was sprawled on the rug, building something elaborate with his Legos. It was just a regular, cozy snowstorm night, until it wasn't. The first thing I noticed was the silence. 1 second, the wind was howling, the fire was snapping, and Ethan was humming some random tune. The next, it all just stopped, like someone had pressed mute on the whole world. I remember looking up from my phone, confused, and catching Mom's eye. She'd frozen mid-stitch, her knitting needles suspended in the air. "What's that?" Ethan asked, his voice small, as he pointed toward the window. I turned my head and saw it. This unnatural lime-green glow bleeding through the curtains, so bright it drowned out the soft orange flicker of the fire. My first thought was that it had to be the neighbor's floodlights, but that didn't make sense. They lived half a mile away, and this light was pulsing, shifting like it was alive. It wasn't just coming from one window, either. Every single one of them was glowing. Dad was the first to move, standing up and walking cautiously to the largest window in the living room. "It's probably the plow," he said, though his voice wavered in a way that made me doubt he believed it. He pulled the curtain back, just a sliver, and I watched his expression shift. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "What is it?" Mom asked, her needles clicking together as she set them down and stood. He didn't answer, just kept staring out at whatever was beyond the glass. The green light reflected off his face, casting harsh shadows under his eyes and making him look older, almost ghostly. I couldn't take it anymore. I crossed the room and yanked the curtain back fully. That's when I realized this wasn't coming from a snowplow, or anything I could even begin to explain. The entire yard was bathed in green, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, but it wasn't like sunlight or even a floodlight. It was otherworldly, almost liquid, seeping into every crevice of the snowy landscape. The glow didn't come from a single point, either. It was everywhere at once, like the air itself had turned radioactive. My breath fogged up the glass as I stared, my mind racing to make sense of it. There were no shadows, no shapes, just this endless, pulsating light that seemed to hum faintly, just on the edge of hearing. Mom gasped, and Ethan clung to her leg, his little fingers digging into the fabric of her jeans. I heard him whisper, "It's moving," and that's when I noticed it too. The light wasn't stationary. It was shifting, sliding across the snow like a living thing. It crept closer to the house, and my chest tightened with a fear I didn't understand. "Close the curtains," Mom said, her voice sharp but trembling. Dad hesitated, his hand still clutching the edge of the fabric, his eyes glued to the light outside. "Jim!" she shouted, snapping him out of his trance. He let the curtain fall shut and backed away, his face pale. The room felt heavier somehow, the green glow still leaking in from the edges of the curtains, painting strange patterns on the walls. "It's just some kind of weather phenomenon," Dad muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. I wanted to believe him, but my gut told me this wasn't natural. Ethan whimpered, and Mom pulled him into her arms, stroking his hair like he was a toddler again. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice cracking. No one answered. The four of us just stood there, frozen, as the light shifted again, sliding across the windows like it was searching for a way in. The sound came next. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to set my teeth on edge, a low, vibrating hum that made the floor feel like it was trembling beneath our feet. It started as a distant pulse, but it grew steadily, like it was building toward something. "Is it an earthquake?" Ethan asked, his voice muffled against Mom's chest. But it didn't feel like an earthquake. It felt alive. The humming seemed to sync with the green light, each pulse of sound making the glow flicker, almost like it was breathing. My hands were clammy, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Stay away from the windows," Dad ordered, his voice firm now, though his hands were shaking. He grabbed the flashlight from the fireplace mantel and turned it on, as if that small beam of yellow light could somehow protect us from whatever was outside. For a moment, it felt like time stretched out endlessly. We stood there, barely breathing, as the humming and the light continued their eerie dance. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The light, however, didn't fade. It intensified, growing so bright that it bled through the thick curtains and lit up the room as though a green sun had risen right outside. I could see every detail of the furniture, every speck of dust in the air, all tinted in that unnatural glow. "This isn't normal," Mom whispered, clutching Ethan tighter. What do they want? The question hung in the air, unanswered, but it chilled me to the core. They? Who were they? I wanted to laugh it off as her nerves talking, but deep down, it made sense. The light didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. Then, without warning, the light began to retreat. Slowly at first, like it was being pulled away, and then faster, disappearing across the snow and into the woods beyond our yard. It was almost worse watching it leave. The silence it left behind was suffocating, like the entire house was holding its breath. "It's over," Dad said finally, though he didn't sound relieved. More like he was trying to convince himself. We didn't move for what felt like forever, just listening, waiting for the light to return. But it didn't. The snowstorm picked up again, the wind howling and the branches outside creaking like nothing had happened. But we knew better. Mom insisted we all sleep in the living room that night, though none of us slept much. Even Ethan stayed awake, his little body curled up on the couch but his eyes wide open, watching the windows. The next morning, the world outside looked completely ordinary, like the night before had been some shared nightmare. The snow had stopped, leaving a pristine, glittering blanket over everything. But something about it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling as I stared out the window, watching the sunlight hit the snow in sharp, clean angles. There weren't any tracks, not from animals, not even from the wind blowing across the surface. It was eerily smooth, untouched. Shouldn't there be some sign of it? I asked, mostly to myself, but Mom heard me. She shook her head, busying herself with pouring coffee, though her hands shook so much she nearly spilled it. "We're not talking about this," she said firmly. That wasn't like her. Mom was the type to dissect every little thing, always needing an explanation. For her to shut it down made me realize just how scared she was. Dad, of course, had already moved into full denial mode. It was probably some kind of weird atmospheric thing. Northern lights, maybe. "You know how crazy the weather's been this winter." He sounded so casual, but he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes as he spoke. Ethan didn't say anything at all. He just sat at the kitchen table, pushing his cereal around his bowl, his face pale and drawn. I wanted to believe Dad. I really did. But the light wasn't like anything I'd ever seen, and no amount of weather phenomena could explain the way it had moved, the way it seemed to look at us through the windows. It didn't feel like the kind of thing you could just write off. I could tell none of us really believed it, even if we pretended to for the sake of getting through breakfast. By midday, I couldn't stand being cooped up in the house anymore. The tension between us was suffocating, so I bundled up in my thickest coat and boots and told Dad I was going to shovel the driveway. He hesitated, then nodded, handing me a scarf like it was some kind of shield. "Don't go too far," he said, his voice lower than usual. I stepped outside, the cold biting my cheeks instantly. The air smelled sharp and clean, and for a second, I almost convinced myself that last night had been a weird dream. But as I reached the edge of the driveway, something caught my eye. There, at the far end of the yard, right where the woods began, the snow wasn't smooth like everywhere else. It was sunken, like something heavy had been there, pressing down the surface. I felt a chill run through me, and not just from the cold. Against my better judgment, I trudged over to the spot, my boots crunching loudly in the otherwise silent yard. The depression in the snow wasn't just random. It was a perfect circle, about 10 feet wide. The snow inside it was oddly textured, almost crystallized, and it sparkled unnaturally in the sunlight, throwing off faint greenish reflections. My stomach churned as I crouched down, brushing my gloved hand over the surface. It wasn't just snow. The top layer had hardened into something slick and glassy, almost like ice, but not. It didn't melt when I touched it, and the air around it felt warmer than it should have. I scrambled back to my feet, heart pounding, and stumbled back toward the house, my earlier bravery completely gone. I burst back into the house, kicking off my boots and shouting for Dad. He came rushing out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his face already twisted in frustration. "What is it now?" he asked, but his tone softened when he saw my expression. "There's something outside," I blurted, my words tumbling over each other. "In the yard, near the woods, there's this weird patch in the snow. It's like ice, but it's not normal." Mom appeared in the doorway, holding a mug of tea, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're just shaken up from last night," she said, her voice carefully measured, like she was trying to calm a spooked animal. "No, you don't understand," I snapped, louder than I intended. "You have to see it for yourself." Dad sighed, grabbing his coat, and followed me outside. I led him to the edge of the yard, where the strange circle glimmered in the sunlight. "See," I said, gesturing wildly. He crouched down, frowning as he inspected the crystallized surface. "That's odd," he muttered, brushing his fingers over it. "Feels almost like resin or something." He stood up, his brow furrowed, but he didn't say anything more. I could tell he was trying to come up with a rational explanation, but his silence told me he couldn't. We headed back to the house, and for the rest of the day, he avoided talking about it altogether. Mom pretended not to notice, burying herself in chores, but I could see the tension in her shoulders every time she glanced toward the windows. That night, none of us could relax. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it were waiting for something to happen. I lay on the couch, pretending to watch TV, but my eyes kept flicking to the windows. Every time I thought I saw a flicker of green, my chest tightened. Ethan refused to sleep in his room, curling up under a blanket next to me instead. I couldn't blame him. The memory of that light, how it had felt like it was watching us, refused to leave me. Around midnight, the power went out. The sudden plunge into darkness made all of us freeze. "It's probably just the storm messing with the lines," Dad said, though there hadn't been any snow or wind since earlier that morning. He lit a couple of candles, their tiny flames doing little to ease the heavy, oppressive feeling that had settled over the house. Then we heard it, the hum. Faint at first, almost easy to dismiss as my imagination, but it grew louder with each passing second. The floor seemed to vibrate beneath us, and Ethan clutched my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "It's back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. Dad grabbed the flashlight again, but this time, he didn't bother with the windows. "Stay here," he said firmly, heading toward the front door. "Jim, no." Mom called after him, but he ignored her. He opened the door, stepping out onto the porch, and the cold rushed in, cutting through the warmth of the house. I couldn't see much from where I sat, but I could hear his footsteps crunching on the snow, and then silence. Not even the hum. Just nothing. We all held our breath, waiting for Dad to say something, to come back inside. But the seconds dragged on, and the silence grew heavier, pressing against my ears. "Jim." Mom called out, her voice cracking. When he didn't respond, she moved toward the door, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. My heart was racing, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't make myself move. Then, finally, we heard him. His footsteps crunched on the snow again, slowly at first, then faster, almost frantic. The flashlight beam swept wildly across the windows before the door burst open, and he stumbled back inside, slamming it shut behind him. Dad was pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face glistening with sweat despite the freezing temperature outside. "What happened?" Mom demanded, rushing to him, but he shook his head, refusing to answer. "We're leaving," he said finally, his voice low and hoarse. "First thing in the morning." That was all he would say. He didn't even take off his coat, just sat down in the recliner and stared at the floor. I wanted to ask him what he'd seen, but something in his expression stopped me. Whatever it was, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, the hum gone but the weight of the event still pressing down on all of us. None of us slept. When dawn finally came, we packed up and left without looking back. We drove away as the sun rose, its soft orange light cutting through the lingering fog. The house looked smaller in the rearview mirror, shrinking into the distance until it was just a speck, then nothing at all. Nobody spoke during the drive. Even Ethan, who usually couldn't sit still for 5 minutes, stayed quiet, staring out the window with a blank expression. I kept replaying the night over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the less it felt like something I could explain. That green light, the hum, the way the air itself seemed alive, it wasn't the kind of thing you could rationalize or forget. Dad didn't explain what he'd seen that night, and none of us had the courage to press him. I think we all just wanted to put it behind us. Months later, I overheard him on the phone with a friend. It wasn't natural, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever it wasn't from here. That sentence stuck with me, sending a chill down my spine every time I thought about it. To this day, I don't know what we experienced. Was it some strange atmospheric event? Something extraterrestrial? Or something else entirely? I've read about other people seeing strange lights in the sky, but nothing quite like what we saw that night. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear that hum again, faint and distant. I always check the windows, holding my breath as I pull back the curtains. So far, the green glow hasn't come back, but part of me wonders if it ever really left. Avalanche near miss. I've been a snowplow driver for almost 8 years now, and nothing could have prepared me for what happened last winter. It was a regular overnight shift in the mountains, the kind where you're battling against the clock and the relentless snow to keep the roads clear for the morning. The forecast had been pretty bad, strong winds, heavy snowfall, and sub-zero temperatures, but that's just part of the job. I started my route around midnight, working my way up a steep, winding pass that I've cleared more times than I can count. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, from the crunch of the tires on packed snow to the faint whistle of the wind outside. The air was so heavy it felt like the mountain was holding its breath. Around 2 a.m., I came across a massive snowdrift blocking the road near a sharp turn. It wasn't unusual for drifts to form there, it's a natural wind trap, but this one was bigger than usual, stretching across both lanes like a frozen wall. My gut told me something wasn't right, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Normally, I'd start clearing it immediately, but I hesitated. Instead, I stopped the truck, left the engine idling, and got out to take a closer look. That's when I noticed it. The snow didn't look packed or solid. It was loose, powdery, and almost sagging, like it was barely clinging to the slope above. I don't know why, but I just stood there, staring at it, my breath clouding in the icy air. As I stood there, something shifted, literally. A faint rumble, so deep it was more of a vibration in my chest than a sound, rolled through the air. At first, I thought it was the truck, but the engine noise wasn't the same. Then, almost in slow motion, I saw the upper layers of snow start to give way, flowing downward in a ripple that built into a terrifying wave. An avalanche. I didn't even have time to think. I scrambled back into the cab and threw the truck into reverse, the tires spinning on the icy surface before catching just enough traction to pull me back down the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I stopped maybe 50 feet down the road, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. From the rearview mirror, I watched the avalanche consume the exact spot where I had been standing just seconds earlier. The snow came crashing down with a deafening roar, slamming into the road and spilling over the edge into the ravine below. It was surreal, like something out of a disaster movie, but I was there, watching it unfold with my own eyes. If I had started clearing that drift, there's no way I would have made it out. The plow, and me with it, would have been swept away like a toy in a tidal wave. I sat there in the truck, frozen, not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of what had just happened. My hands were still gripping the wheel like a lifeline, my knuckles white as I tried to process it. The avalanche had completely blocked the road, burying it under what looked like tons of snow. It wasn't just a drift anymore, it was a solid, impenetrable wall. I kept thinking about how close I'd been, how one split-second decision had saved me from being buried alive. And the scariest part? I couldn't even tell you why I hesitated. There wasn't a logical reason, no training manual that said, stop and stare at the snow. It was just instinct, pure and simple. After a few minutes, I forced myself to check the radio. My voice cracked as I called on the avalanche to dispatch, trying to sound calm even though my hands were still trembling. They told me to stay put, that a rescue team would head out as soon as it was safe. Safe. The word felt hollow out there in the dark, with the mountain still looming over me like a predator waiting for its next move. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees and rattling the truck's windows. Every little sound made me jump, branches creaking, snow settling. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain wasn't done with me yet. I turned off the engine to save fuel, and that's when the real quiet set in. No rumble of the truck, no static from the radio, just the wind and the occasional groan of shifting snow. I tried to focus on anything but the what-ifs running through my mind, but it was impossible. I kept replaying the moment I'd stopped to look at the snow, trying to make sense of it. If I'd been a little more tired, or distracted, or if I'd just ignored that gut feeling, I wouldn't be sitting there now. It felt like the mountain had given me a warning, like it had decided to let me go this time, but only just. The hours dragged on, and the cold started seeping through the truck. I wrapped myself in my coat and cranked up the heat every so often, but it didn't help much. I felt trapped, not just physically but mentally. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that wave of snow rushing down, swallowing everything in its path. The thought of stepping out of the truck to stretch my legs sent a shiver down my spine, like the mountain was waiting for me to make a wrong move. When the rescue team finally arrived just before dawn, I'd never been so relieved to see other people. Their headlights cut through the darkness like a lifeline, pulling me back to reality. The rescue team assessed the situation quickly, their voices crackling over radios as they coordinated. They looked calm, almost casual, like this was just another day for them, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how close I'd come to not making it out. One of them came over to check on me, shining a flashlight into the cab and asking if I was okay. I nodded, though I felt anything but. My body was stiff, my head buzzing with adrenaline and exhaustion. As they worked to clear a path or at least assess the damage, I stayed put, watching through the frosted window, too shaken to even step outside. When the sun started to rise, the scene became almost surreal. The light revealed the full scale of the avalanche. Massive piles of snow, broken branches, and debris scattered across the road and into the ravine below. It was like looking at the aftermath of a battle, and it hit me just how insignificant I was out there against the power of nature. Even now, I can't explain what made me stop that night, what instinct kicked in and kept me from moving forward. All I know is that if I hadn't listened to it, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Sometimes, it feels like the mountain let me go. Other times, it feels like it was just a random twist of fate. Either way, I don't think I'll ever drive that stretch of road the same way again.